The Joyful Friar podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan Castle, your host. Today we'll be doing part 3 of a trilogy. This is Sherman, Angel Ralph, and Travel Agent Merle. In the first part of the trilogy, we told his story, the basics of it. He died in a multi-vehicle collision precipitated by the fact that something was being carried on the flatbed of a large 18-wheeler. But it was not it wasn't in a box, in a container box. It was some odd-sized equipment that Sherman thought was either heating and air conditioning or something. But the issue was it was too tall for the tunnel. And when it hit the facing of the tunnel, it pulled the vehicle to a halt at highway speed. Stuff tumbled out. Other cars ran into it, fireball, and a number of deaths, including Sherman. Well, we did that. We tell the story, the basis of it, in the first part of this trilogy. Then in the second part, we call it compassionate response. And the way that the story read to me, Sherman was very good at what I think was self-talk. He was a businessman, and he talked about how I knew how to compartmentalize things in an appropriate way and to not let emotional experiences that happened at home before I left for work to interfere with my behavior in the workplace. And I could put things aside and deal with them later. So he wasn't being in denial. He was just being a mature adult, being able to separate out emotional content and responsibilities and have each thing belong in its place. Well, anyway, I just thought the way that he described how he went through the tragic sudden loss of his life on Earth in a car accident, he did a really nice job. He said, I had good helpers who helped me separate out um, the sad emotions and anger and grief and deal with them uh, uh, without letting them override my every thought and my every movement. He said, I wanted to stay the active agent of my life even after its death my death on a highway. He said, I still knew that I had a future and I was learning about it, and I needed to be clear-headed in order to do that and do it well. So in compassionate response, I just thought he speaks well for himself, and that he could help us in responding not just to end of life tragedy, but whatever it is that might be going on in our lives that has the power to emotionally sideline us and take away some of our freedom to act. Today, we're going to be going into what we call spiritual practice that I think has a connection to this story. And this is the first time we're telling one of these trilogy stories that has not already been written about in a book. You have the book right over my shoulder, the more recent one, book 3. Um, so I usually am able to say in a podcast, if you want the more detail in the story, just go to the book. Well, I can't do that because we haven't printed this anywhere yet, at least. And so I'm going to do a little bit more reading. So I want to say a word, first of all, about a way to approach reading something to another as a form of communication. I live in the Catholic Church, and in the Catholic and the other Christian churches, and in Judaism and Islam, very often, and maybe other places too, there's some sacred text that's proclaimed by a reader in public at worship. In our case, we believe that the scriptures are the inspired word of God, that somehow they're breathed alive by moving through the lungs and vocal cords of a reader to a congregation that is in part audience, because audio is the word to listen to hear. So technically at that moment, I hardly ever use that word because it often can sound in worship like everything that happens up front is the performance, and all that everybody else is there to do is to watch the show, and that couldn't be further from the truth. But technically, when the word is being proclaimed at public worship, like the Catholic Mass, we're actively listening not just to a dead letter, to words on a page and somebody reading from a book. We're listening to the author who wrote that, the story they were telling, how God's activity, how God's own breath moves through it. So uh, today I'm going to be reading to you, but not a dead letter. I want to have the authors of a couple of different pieces of writing speak through me, come alive. That's just the way I understand that works. Well, um, I thought that Sherman was so good about staying in the present moment, recognizing that his present moment just did a great big shift. He left the world of time and space that he was familiar with because his body died in a car crash. He had a little bit of adjustment to do, gathering up things. He felt like there was some sort of gathering function when leaving the body, and he needed to take with him what was essential. Well, he did something like that, but it got acted out in the dreamscape as a cell phone, and he mentioned a wallet. He talked about the way that one might be careful when leaving a plane to check the the seat pocket in front of you, the overhead bin, make sure that you've got the car keys, the whatever, all of that. He said there was something like that as I left my body. I felt the need to make sure I gathered what of me could go with me that was essential. He was taken somewhere in a van, brought to a place that at first was unpleasant, but he said it wasn't that I was being punished. I made it unpleasant. I was sad, and the place that I was brought to conformed to my emotion. He said other people helped me through that, and before long I understood that I just needed to adapt. And I was old enough that I'd adapted to lots of different things over the course of a life, and I just thought, here's another opportunity for me to adapt. Well, much of that is told in the other two podcasts, but today, we never tell any of these stories without first getting a person's permission. So we go back to them, and we did that recently, only last week, as a matter of fact, with Dave, one of my prayer partners, who was in this exchange a year and a half ago when we first met Sherman. And we went into prayer, protected ourselves with St. Michael the Archangel, Holy Mary, a number of the saints, St. Dominic, the patron of or the founder of my religious order. Anyway, we went back and we asked him, and wasn't at all surprised to hear that it was a short conversation because he's kind of to the point kind of guy. And so there'll be a little bit of that. But mostly, I think the point that I'd like to emphasize today in terms of spiritual practice is he was extraordinarily good, Sherman was, of staying in the present moment even when he left time and space that we're familiar with in a body. He was still himself, and he was still someplace, and he still had memories of past things. He had a present moment for sure, and he had a future. So they weren't all happening in the same way that they were happening before, but he was staying in the present moment and doing the present duty. That's what I want to drive home today. Think about Earth time, that what we call a day, 24 hours I was taught in school, in elementary school, was that's the time it takes for the Earth to spin around its axis once. There was this imaginary stick running through the North and South poles through the Earth's core, and it took it 24 hours to turn all the way around, and that's a day. And then a year was the time it took for the whole ball, the whole orb of the Earth to circle the sun. That's a year, an Earth year, an Earth day, an Earth year. But if you think about it, if we were on Mars, well, Mars would have its own sense of the rotation of itself, and it wouldn't be 24 hours, it'd be something different. And then Mars is further from the sun, its orbit is larger. It would take more than an Earth year, or a Mercury year would be very fast compared to the Earth because it's got a shorter orbit to move about. Anyway, time is relative, and humanity was becoming aware of that in the early 1900s with Einstein and Niels Bohr and others who helped us understand relativity and time being a relative thing. And Sharman left that kind of time, but there was still something else. He was very good at staying in the present moment when he was in the world of past, present, future, measured by clocks and calendars. but he maintained a kind of a practice of staying focused on what's right now. And he felt it was important to stay focused on what's right here and what's right now so that he could make the best possible choices about what he might do next. Well, I'm going to I'm going to read to you a little bit from one of my all-time favorite books. In fact, sometimes I've been asked, what's your favorite book? And I've sometimes said it's this one, C.S. Lewis Screwtape Letters. This particular copy of it is yellowed. It's just a little paperback, but the book goes back to it was written in the late 1930s. Second World War in Europe was already underway. America didn't into it until late 1941, but bombs were falling on London before that, and he was living in England. C.S. Lewis was writing at the time that Europe was already going or already in its Second World War. Uh, and he was writing about spiritual things, but he was doing it in that place and that time. He wrote the Screwtape Letters, which he calls an interrupted correspondence. He's using an allegory to try to explain um, eternal mysteries, but he does it through this device of what he calls the Screwtape Letters. He says it's an interrupted partial correspondence. The construct that he's created in the Screwtape Letters is that there's a master demon and an apprentice demon who's being trained to ruin his first human soul. And the master demon, Screwtape, is teaching Wormwood, the apprentice, how to ruin a human soul. One of the ways that he does it is by talking about time and what he calls that abominable advantage of the enemy. Because he's coming from a demonic point of view, he's always refers to God as the enemy, and especially of the incarnation of Jesus into time and space is that abominable advantage of the enemy, of having lived in time and space. He reminds Wormwood that we demons are not native to this place. We enter into it, but um, we're not naturally subject to the movement of past, present, and future inside of Earth time. But while we're in it, we need to understand how to use it to our advantage. He also says that everything that the Creator, which he calls the enemy, has made is good, and that they don't have anything evil with which to work. They don't have any raw material that's evil. They all only can take something that was created good and then twist it in some way to some inappropriate use, something that goes against the natural order that becomes an evil. So he's talking about how to take time, and he's explaining it to Wormwood, and he says it has. I'm gonna read from it, but he says. You and my they're writing back and forth to one another. Wormwood has to give him full written reports on the progress that he's making, and then Screwtape is commenting on it, and often unkindly because he's a demon. But he says, "My dear Wormwood, I noticed, of course, that the humans were having a lull in their European war, what they naively call the war, and I'm not surprised that there is a corresponding lull in the patient's anxieties. Do we want to encourage this or keep him worried? Well, tortured fear and stupid confidence are both desirable states of mind. Our choice between them raises important questions. The humans live in time, but our enemy destines them to eternity. I believe that. I believe I'm both mortal and immortal. I'm temporal and eternal. All that's going on right now. I think it's true of you. The enemy, therefore, wants them to attend chiefly to two things, to eternity itself and to that point of time which they call the present. Those are the two things that Screwtape says are important. Humans, if they're out for what's best for them, they pay attention to their eternal being or their present moment. Either of those are good for them. The present is that point at which time touches eternity. Of the present moment and of it only, humans have an experience analogous to the experience which our enemy has of reality as a whole. It alone has freedom and actuality. The enemy would therefore have them constantly concerned either about eternity, which means being concerned about him, or with the present, either meditating on their eternal union or separation from himself, or else obeying the present voice of conscience, bearing the present cross, receiving the present grace, giving thanks through the present pleasure. I'm as apt as anybody to especially run into the future and try to prognosticate all kind of things or get worried or whatever, or sometimes pine away for what I used to have that I don't anymore, that kind of thing. And I know very well, and partly because of C.S. Lewis, that I'll be at my most best and composed if I stay in the present moment or turn my mind to eternal things. That's why I have a series on the afterlife, that we're all going to survive our deaths. Well, our business, he says, is to get them away from the eternal and from the present. With this in view, we sometimes tempt a human, say a widow or a scholar, to live in the past. But this is of limited value, for they have some real knowledge of the past, and it has a determinate nature, and to that extent it resembles eternity. There's reality in the past, and the demons always want to stay away from reality because it's made by God. It has truth in it. It's far better to get them to live in the future. Biological necessity makes all their passions point in that direction already. So that thought about the future inflames hopes and fears. Also, it's unknown to them. They don't know the future. So, in making them think about it, we get them to think about unrealities. When we think about the future, we're thinking about unrealities. In a word, the future is, of all things, the thing least like eternity. It's the most completely temporal part of time. For the past is frozen and it no longer flows. The present is all lit up with eternal rays. Hence the encouragement we've given to all those schemes of thought like creative evolution and scientific humanism or communism that fix people's attentions on the future on that very core of temporality. Hence, nearly all vices are rooted in the future. Gratitude looks to the past, and love looks to the present. Fear, avarice, lust, ambition, they look ahead. Don't think that lust is an exception. When the present pleasure arrives, the sin, which alone interests us, is already over. The pleasure is just part of the process which we regret and would exclude if we could, without losing the sin. It's the part contributed by the enemy, and therefore it's experienced in a present. The sin, which is our contribution, looks forward. Well, I hope you're following that. Uh, Lewis was a great scholar, but one of his gifts, I think, was being able to speak to uh, the rest of us and make things easily understood. So uh, keep them fixed on the future, however you do it, because it always is the most unreal part of time. To be sure, the enemy wants people to think of the future too, just so much as it's necessary for now planning the acts of justice or charity, which will probably be their duty tomorrow. You know, it's reasonable to think ahead to applying for a job or, in school. I always was having to, manage the tasks that were when things were due and so on. I still live like that. But he says it's it's appropriate for the humans to pay attention to the future when it helps them do their present duty. That's not what we're talking about. Planning tomorrow's work is today's duty, though the material is borrowed from the future. Now, this is straw splitting. He doesn't want people to give the future their hearts to place their treasure in it, but we do. His ideal, God's ideal, is a person who, having worked all day for the good of posterity, if that's his vocation, washes his mind of the whole subject, commits the issue to heaven, and returns at once to the patience or the gratitude demanded by the moment that's passing over him. But we want a man hag-ridden by the future, haunted by visions of an imminent heaven or hell upon earth, ready to break the enemy's commands at the present, if in doing so we make him think that he can attain one or avert the other, dependent for his faith on the success or failures of his schemes, whose end he won't even live to see. We want a whole race perpetually in the pursuit of the rainbow's end, never honest, nor kind, nor happy now, but always using as mere fuel wherewith to heap upon the altar of the future every real gift that's offered them in the present. I love that. Get them perpetually chasing the rainbow's end, then they won't pay any attention to the present moment. Well, it follows in general that other things being equal, it's better for your patient to be filled with anxiety or hope, it doesn't much matter which, about this war. You know, it was the early part of World War II, than for him to be living in the present. But the phrase living in the present is ambiguous. It may describe a process which is really just as much concerned with the future as anxiety is itself. Your man may be untroubled about the future, not because he's concerned with the present, but because he's persuaded himself that the future is going to be agreeable. As long as that's the real source of his tranquility will do us good because it's only piling up more disappointment and therefore more impatience for him when his false hopes are dashed. So it's not just a kind of cheesy, tinny optimism about the future. It's uh, by extension, Lewis is saying it's best for us to stay in the present moment and do what we can to affect a positive future. Um, Waiting and joyful hope is a part of the Advent season when I'm uh, making this podcast, and I am hopeful, but I won't be a spoiled child the day after Christmas if my hopes don't come true in the way that I formed them. It's God's universe and not mine, and I can hope for a thing, but I also want to be grateful in the present moment and accepting of whatever comes, and trust that God will provide what I need to do the present duty, move through the present trouble. On the other hand, if he's aware that horrors may be in store for him and he's praying for the virtues wherewith to meet them, and meanwhile concerning himself with the present, because there and there alone is all duty, all grace, all knowledge, and all pleasure dwell, his state is very undesirable, and it should be attacked at once. The dark side doesn't want us being in the present moment, praying for the grace to perform the present task. Here again, our philological arm has done good work. Try the word complacency on him. But of course, it's most likely that he is living in the present for none of these reasons, but simply because his health is good and he's enjoying his work. That phenomenon would be just merely natural. At the same time, I'd break it up if I were you. No natural phenomenon is really in our favor. And anyway, why should the creature be happy? Your affectionate Uncle Screwtape. Well, um, I hope you don't mind being read to. It's just for me, I absorbed this lesson decades ago, and I've lived with it, especially when my own spirit begins to be disturbed about the possibility of something looming in the future that might be hurtful or frightening or something. Uh, when I find myself doing that, I try to say, remember to live in the present moment and ask for the present grace to uh, to address the present task. Right? Because this podcast has to do with death and afterlife, I know that I'm mortal. I'm going to die of something. There's going to come a time when prayers for my health will not be answered, not for my physical health, for my body to live on forever in this form because it's not designed that way. I'm going to die. I have an expiration date. So I don't pray for even my own health as an unlimited physical good. You know, but I do ask if it could be your will, may I please have good health. Um, but if I don't, would you give me the strength, the grace, the mercy, the patience to move through it as best I can and not to lose sight of my primary vocation, which is to serve you? You know how pain can make a person really selfish. It can be hard to move out of oneself in the service of others when you have a toothache or a backache, which is more my issue, or some other kind of distress. It can be difficult to be at peace in the present moment and be useful and of service, but I just think it's critical to a life well lived, staying in the present moment. Well, that's That's Screw Tapes or C.S. Lewis's contribution to the importance of of staying in the present moment. Sherman just did it with such grace. When he came to us, we don't tell these stories without getting permission, and we don't ask that permission when they're in the middle of moving from plane to plane, as we're invited to help them to begin with. But their angels very often come on the line after I read the story to my prayer partners. We read it once for the mind and once for the heart, and then I very often with the guardian of the person who brought this story to me in a dream, would you mind coming on the line first and speaking through us to clarify anything in the dream that we might not have gotten correct? Dreams of their nature can have symbology that one could misread. Or there might be things like a person died in a car crash, but they didn't indicate to me whether they were male or female. I'd like to know that. There might be a crowd scene, and I'm not sure exactly who's telling the story, who's narrating it, and who we might be helping. Will we help one or more than one? So there's sometimes places where the guardian can give some clarity, and Sherman's guardian he goes by the name Ralph. He didn't say why, he just said, "I'm Ralph." And he's talking to my friend and prayer partner Dave, and he said, when we first met, I had some unspoken hope that this day might come. So Angel Ralph was already kind of hoping that maybe this story would be told publicly, and now it is. Um, uh, Angel Ralph says the universe that God put in motion and brought into being is all about love. Life upon the earth can be thought of as a school of love, and how one might let the love of the Creator shine through one's own frame, one's own embodied life. When I'm asked, do I have a sense of my life's purpose? I say, yes, I know what it is. It's to receive love first from the source who is love, from the one who created everything, who is love. Receive love, magnify love, magnifying to make larger sometimes has like a magnifying glass. You might not have been able to see a thing except that somebody magnified it and made what was there but not easily seen now magnified. So um, I try to receive love, magnify love, and offer love, give love away. That's the way I understand my purpose. He said, even though my job was to see to the safety of the one here known as Sherman, there's more to that role than simply trying to keep one from harm. He obviously came to a violent end. Had I understood my entire responsibility to keep him safe from dying in a traffic accident, I colossally failed. But I understood always that my job in guarding an immortal soul made of the divine substance, which is love, would go well beyond the safekeeping of that temporary body. I was so proud of him, how he handled himself through that process. And I think the way he spoke, even in the moment of crossing that you assisted with, showed a lot of freedom and wisdom. And my friend Dave, who was one of the prayer partners in this one, said, yes, that's the reason I picked it. I knew that I wanted to tell some stories that aren't in print. I went to my prayer partners, a few of them, and said, would you go back into the files of stories that you took part in, because different people take part in different ones. I said, would you go back and pray over any of the stories that you've taken part in and ask which of these would be helpful to people? They probably all would, but with this kind of sense of extraordinary possibility, are there stories in here that might be especially helpful to people? And my friend Dave said, I think you'd like this one. So he emailed it back to me. He said, yes, that's why I picked it. I was kind of led to it. And Angel Ralph said to him, well, Dave, I think you're intelligent and wise. And then Angel Ralph said, I really don't need to be here any longer. I've done, I just want you to know I'm here, and I'm praying for my friend, because the guardians continue to love us even after we've left the body. Um, well, we sat still and invited Sherman to speak through in this prophetic gift. And he said, here I am. You might recall, Dave, that my surname is Sherman. He said, you're now asking me if it's okay to use my story. He said, you've told so many stories in public that the strangeness of it wouldn't be anything new, this part about letting somebody speak through. It would only be the details inside the story that might be different. And then he said this, I didn't say anything that wasn't true. That's important. One thing that might be a concern is that the conversation I had with you, there was very little of grieving or sadness of leaving behind a wife and kids, coworkers, or anyone else. Listen to this. That's not because I didn't grieve the sudden separation that comes with dying, but these conversations are really a snapshot. They're not the overview of an entire life. The crossings that you do only take about half an hour normally, and they're really a task. There's not necessarily a lot of background about how one got from dying suddenly to being ready to do this movement. I just want it said that I loved my family and all my loved ones dearly, as much as any reader or listener might love their own. I wouldn't want anyone to think that I was callous in the quick leaving behind of such strong bonds. So I loved my wife, I loved my kids, I loved my friends, I loved my coworkers. The fact that I talk about moving through this process in what might seem to be a very logical, methodical way doesn't mean I wasn't grieving. I did grieve. But he said, I kind of did that off to the side. I didn't let it intrude upon the work that I had to do of moving forward. Dave said, well, I didn't feel that way at all when you were talking about it, but I'm sure Father Nathan will make sure that he tells in his podcast that you love your family and cared about them, and I've done that. Well, Sherman said, well, he has someone inquiring of him right now about the loss of his spouse. Many of you contact me through email, and recently there's a person of faith whose spouse um, has died, and but she's still living, and she's wondering if whatever the joys of heaven are in Christian language, can those joys be so abundant and overwhelming that they can make a person move beyond the love of the ones they left behind? In other words, the love that you had here, as deep as it might have been, are you going to be exposed to joys of heaven that completely obliterate that and make it seem unimportant? He said, that's certainly not the case for me, and I doubt it is for anyone else. And I love this line. This is just Sherman. He's not a theologian. He's just a guy that got killed on a highway. He said, expanding in love doesn't mean subtraction. Loving more and more and more doesn't mean that because you love more, that you love this one less. Love more, 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 and that doesn't mean you're leaving anybody behind. There's a necessity of focusing one's attention on what's at hand, but because I'm inside Nathan, I'm accessing some of his thoughts and emotions with regard to my story that he's just recently reread several times. He liked the way that I spoke of myself as a businessman who knew how to compartmentalize his thoughts and emotions in order to be good at his work. And that's true. I did. Didn't I make a reference to you, Dave, being a dentist and hoping that if you drill into my teeth, you're not in that moment angry at your wife or the dog? And they laughed about that. That you want your surgeon or your dentist to be paying full attention to what's right in front of him and not being distracted by something that happened a while ago or somewhere else. There's an importance in focusing on what's here and now and then having other moments perhaps where one is more sentimental. I was trying to avoid using the word sad, but maybe I don't need to avoid it. There's a certain sadness that comes with the abrupt leaving of one's family. But I tried to make sure that that had its moment, it had its place, but it wasn't always free to intrude into my thoughts and behaviors randomly. I think that's important. And I think that's a really a mature adult life skill is to be able to have a full range of one's emotions and be able to feel them, but not have them intrude uh, in what he said into my thoughts and my behaviors. You know? Uh, I if I'm with someone, I want to be fully with them and paying attention to them and not being distracted by intrusive grief. And he he thought that he had a kind of a gift for doing that. And he said, "That's just my way. It might not be the way for anybody, but it's what I do, and it's why we wanted to include him in a podcast." He said, "I think you've known lots of other people in these crossings who had a harder time of it after their death because of conflicted emotions with regard to being angry about the way they died. I think the very first one that you ever did was with that man who was angry at God because God took him. That was Ray, who's the first story that's in book one. There have been many others along the way who had to work through a thicket of conflicting emotions. Compared to many others, in reading various transcripts, you found in me someone who had some sadness, but who moved through it by choice. I decided that I'm going to continue to be the happy person I was, even though I have to do it subsequent to dying in a traffic accident. How about that? I was a happy person. Am I going to let, in my eternal being, let the fact that I died tragically in a traffic accident make me an unhappy person? He said, no. I'm, uh, I moved through it by choice. I decided I'm going to continue to be the happy person I was, even though I have to do it subsequent to dying in a traffic accident. I like that kind of attitude, and I try to encourage it in people who are in grief and say, do what you got to do to grieve, but don't buy that idea that you never get over it, you'll always be unhappy or whatever. I don't live that way, and I wouldn't recommend it. Um, when Dave said, "Well, you hit the nail on the head there. That's what I saw in you," and he said, "Well, absolutely. Please use my story, and I hope that people just see that the way I did this is an option and a positive one, but it's not a mandate. People are free to do whatever they like." Maybe it was a little easier for me by disposition or temperament to separate my emotions and my behavior. That's wise. Some people never really learned in childhood that whatever the emotion of the moment is doesn't have to be the instigator of their behavior. They don't even recognize that the two could be separate. Well, they can be. But if you didn't learn that somewhere along the way, maybe that's new information. You don't have to, you're more than your emotions. And Dave said, yeah, that's right, but it'll be a model that people can follow. Um, Sherman has been with me for a few days because I've invited him into my prayer. He said, Father Nathan was preaching on something similar just a short time ago, just within the past 2 hours. I think you're in your Advent season. The biblical readings have to do with valleys and hills and making a road flat. He was saying, yes, except that Jesus went into the valleys and up the peaks. He accompanies us through all things. On the night he was betrayed, he sat at a dinner party, ate with friends, and they sang songs afterward. And then after that, he went off into agonizing prayer. These things can be chosen to some degree. And as with other things, the more one does them, the easier they become. I hadn't any idea I was going to die suddenly on a highway, but I learned through different life experiences how to separate out emotions and behavior and try to choose the most helpful ones. I chose to be the agent of my life and not just be brought along by my emotions. I wanted to be the one who chose when and how to behave. And I believe everybody can do that. As he just finished saying, maybe my temperament and previous experiences made that easier for me, but I believe everybody can do it. They'd have to just get started, and the more you try at a thing, the better you get at it. Well, Dave said, I think that kind of thinking can help other people. And Sherman said, well, I hope it will. I think that served me well. In the time since my death on a highway, I've been able to be with lots of other people doing lots of new things. They've sometimes been complimentary by saying, you're very well adapted to this place, Sherman, or you're doing so well. Now, I don't mean to be vain. It's the same sort of thing that one heard in a classroom in elementary school when you did a lesson well. The praise wasn't intended to flatter you necessarily, but was more to encourage. Well, Dave said, well, when people hear what you're talking about, maybe they won't be so scared about dying and they'll know there's an afterlife. And Sherman said, well, that's essential to your whole sense of being. Nathan's, he said, but and probably why the two of you are so complementary and are partners in this common work. Dave, isn't this true of you too? And he said, yes, it is. And Sherman said, well, there you have it. And Dave said, well, we fit together then, don't we? And Sherman laughed and said, well, I guess we're just three peas in a pod, right? I don't need to stay any longer. You got the answer you requested. Beyond that, I look forward to meeting you when the time is right. And Dave said, sure, same here. And I hope that you can listen to Father Nathan's podcast about yourself. And Sherman said, well, Anything that's available on earth is available to us. We just have to ask for it. It's not that different from going to a library or really having it come to you. You can ask for the knowledge or the experience of just about anything you want. As long as it's in proper order, it happens. I've already done some study of the work that you and he and other prayer partners have done because I was affected by it and interested in it. And Dave said, "Oh, yeah, wonderful. Well, thanks for accepting. I'm looking forward to seeing you when it's my time." And he said, "All right, excellent. Well, enjoy your time today." And it happens that I'm doing this in mid-December, and he said, and enjoy your run up to the Christmas holiday. It's the most wonderful time of the year, isn't it?" And Dave said, "Yes, it is." And Sherman said, "Well, especially in Buffalo, where I'm sure you'll have a white Christmas." And he said, "We probably will." And Sherman just said, "All right, God bless you, my friend." And off he went. So, um, spiritual practice with regard to how we can derive a spiritual practice from hearing Sherman's story, stay in the present moment. Um, One of them is just paying attention to our thoughts, and that yes, the past has loveliness about it. I was just watching a home movies from the 50s. I was watching my older brother and sister open Christmas presents before I was born. We went through time because they're all spliced together on one disc. So this time of the year, we do a lot of things that have sweet nostalgia, and we have traditions where we do what we've always done. We recently at Thanksgiving ate from my parents' fine china. There's a lot of things about the past that can give us warmth and joy and gratitude in the present moment. Um, and then, as we heard Lewis talking about, there are things about the future where we borrow from it in order to plan. I'm going to be doing a wedding over the weekend, and so after I'm done with this, I have other jobs to do. I have mass to say in about an hour. I've got packing to do. I've got Christmas cards to write. There's always things that need to be done that belong to the future, but we borrow from the future in order to do today's duty. But for me, today's duty was to get this podcast done and off to my assistant, Chantel. So I'm I'm done with this and on to the next present moment, but not before I remind you that I'm praying for you. And especially when I pray for you, whether you listen or watch um, this podcast, the audio or the video, I'm always praying for your heart of hearts. And especially I'm interested in, is there anything in you that from the past that it drags forward in a way that makes you sad in the present? And if that's the case, I'm praying that something can dislodge or break loose or melt away, that you can be more free in the present moments and free to move positively into a future that's worthy of you and that is happy. I believe that's God's desire for us. So that's it for this episode and for this trilogy. This has been Sherman, Angel Ralph, and Travel Agent Merle. I'm grateful for your interest in this work. If you have only recently discovered it and you have a question or something, I ask that you first read at least one of the three books in the Afterlife Interrupted series. They're available on Amazon. Um, and then if you want to engage me in some question, you can do that through my website, nathan-castle.com. Go to the contact icon and send me an email, and I'll do my best to try to be back in touch. All right. God bless you. Thanks for being with us today. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless.